The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
Well, some people may have actually preferred it according to the YouTube comments last week. But my voice, the way it was last week, but my voice is almost back to normal this week. So I guess, unfortunately, for those of you who liked it last week, I got my regular voice back. So I guess we'll just have to come to grips with that. But
I think you've got the perfect hybrid voice going right now, Greg.
But in any event, we alluded to talking about a little bit about QAnon and some of the more recent developments there with these videos that came out. I think the SGT report videos are the ones that got all the attention. We had zeroed in on one where these sealed indictments, this website that this guy's put together with all these sealed indictments, and that was something that we used like, wow, well, there may be something to this. And then, of course, the QAnon, the video that SGT Report shared, I think has gotten a lot of attention. I think it's really caused like a resurgency among QAnon in some ways. The plan to save the world. And so I guess I briefly alluded to asking this last week, but if there is something going on with this, because we can link to this, site this person's put together in our.
Was that the 412 Anon?
I believe
something like
so.
That.
Actually, we can link to this this database this guy's put together. Though we can link to it in our show description.
Yeah.
But it got us to thinking if there is something to this, and I think I asked the question last week. We didn't focus too much on it, but I think we're going to focus more on it here. If there's something to this whole idea of some type of efforts to actually indict and prosecute criminal elements within the U.S. government, within some of maybe these Western governments, and maybe within some of these think tanks and big money institutions, then who benefits from it? Is it we the people, or is it simply one resurgent or insurgent base trying to unseat another center of power? And I think that's where we have to go with this when we consider all the people around Trump. I don't think that we can just necessarily dismiss that, QAnon, there's nothing to it, as far as, is there some type of effort to actually really try to maybe clean out some elements of the so-called deep state? But we got to ask, is it being done on behalf of the people, as those who are behind Trump and support Q say it is? Or is it being done on behalf of another entity, perhaps an entity that is centered in a very hard right-wing view of Zionism, of Israel, of foreign policy as it relates to the Middle East and the region of the world, and perhaps a more religious view, and also maybe that's maybe more centered around a multipolar view of the world that steps outside of what we know now as the post-World War II order, which centers around hegemony here in the United States. I think that's where we need to go with this conversation and ask, if there is something going on, who's benefiting from it and who it's being done on behalf of.
That's I think well laid out, Greg, because it is obvious, it's blatant that QAnon is a psyops. Everyone who's being honest admits that. The question is, what kind of psyops is it? And who's behind the psyops, and then also what effect is that psyops having. So, but in a certain way, maybe I might want to reintroduce this terminology of ConOps that I've put forth as maybe a potential evolution of the understanding of psyops, because that, of course, relates to psychological operations. And ConOps refers to a certain unit in the IDF related to consciousness operations. And so ConOps is the shorthand for that. And so it's also interesting that this is very obviously a follow-on to an election cycle where the reality of such things as hardcore consciousness operations, such as we're learning more and more about the involvement of such organizations as Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, the SCL group, but also then more even sort of closer to the ground with even potential certain black operations and wet works operations and honeypot operations such as Black Cube. being involved in all of this, and this also sort of showing this parallel structure to the national security apparatuses worldwide of these parallel corporatized or privatized, in that sort of common parlance of psychological operations or consciousness operations. So ConOps.
By the way, it should be mentioned, you just mentioned Black Cube, and in addition to the Weinstein, in addition to helping target opponents of the Iran deal, particularly architects of the Iran nuclear deal within the Obama administration, it has come out this week that Black Cube worked on behalf of elements within the Hungarian government of Viktor Orban against NGOs and people who are trying to undermine the anti-immigration agenda of within the Hungarian government. And so this is another example here of and I've long suspected, I think we've alluded to this before, that really a lot of people look to Hungary as being a bulwark of this, Western populist, anti kind of globalist kind of against the grain of the globalist liberal New World Order, when in reality it appears that Hungary and Israel in a lot of ways, when it comes to their immigration policies, are really joined at the hip in a lot of ways. I mean, there was an alliance between basically the Israeli government sided with Hungary over this over these more left elements within the Jewish community that were accusing Viktor Orban and Hungary of anti-Semitism for its anti-George Soros campaign. And now it comes out that Black Cube is clearly working on behalf of Israeli intelligence firm, which, by the way, it's interesting to point out that other than Mossad, as a lot of people figure, most of it seems the people involved with Black Cube are actually involved with intelligence related to the IDF. So that's interesting. Whereas you want to look at maybe above Mossad, and that could be lend credence to that whole theory. But now you look at this, and now we've got a direct link between this Israeli firm and Hungary and these elections and this effort to undermine these NGOs that were working to against the migration agenda in Hungary, which, of course, if you look at it from a perspective of a hardcore Zionist clash of civilizations type of narrative, this type of policies are great for you because it keeps alive this narrative that the enemy is in the Middle East, and the enemy is the enemy of Israel in this region of the world. So we do have this Black Cube connection now with Hungary, and I'm guessing more is going to come out in the days and weeks to come regarding this. But I think this is very significant because it's not only is it a Hungary-Israel connection, but it's also Hungary's probably Viktor Orban is probably Vladimir Putin's number one ally in Europe. So this is, I think, is really important.
Well, thank you for pointing that article out to me. And it is interesting, too, that even it made such an establishment journalist as Chris Hayes at least publicly acknowledged there. Isn't this weird?
Yeah.
That you see this.
Remember, Bourdain had put this together, too. For all those people who were saying, well, Hillary and the globalists had him killed, and I don't know, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But, you're not taking into consideration that he was critical of Black Cube for being used by both Weinstein and by people within the Trump administration or in Trump circles against the Iran deal. So
that is interesting too, because we're also at this moment where the Epstein connection, I think, to both campaigns is starting to come back up in a way that it was largely refused across the board in terms of Hillary supporters and Trump supporters, and also the mainstream media. I remember this. I think I've talked about it before. There was at the Dole Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, right after the election was over, there was this sort of round table panel discussion that included members of both the Clinton and the Trump campaigns.
Is this the event where you were questioning John McLaughlin, the pollster?
Yes, and Michael.
Michael Glassner.
Mike Glassner. Yes. And that was actually done after one of these panels was over. And so I posed to the panel whether we should start talking about this connection to Epstein, to both campaigns, and whether the American people had a right to know whether both the candidates that were put forth to us to basically choose between were potentially compromised through some type of sexual blackmail operation related to underage, sexual criminality, and were then basically undermined by a foreign powers intelligence apparatus. And I laid out Epstein and his connection to Ghislaine Maxwell and that whole thing, and there was just utter silence. And they're like, oh, well, moving on. I was like, no, that is a treasonous answer. And then so finally this guy John McLaughlin, who was one of Trump's main pollsters.
Yeah, he was a pollster for Netanyahu in his 2015 re-election campaign. So.
In fact, he came to work for the Trump campaign directly out of a working relationship with Netanyahu in Tel Aviv. And then, of course, this guy Michael Glassner, who had a history with Dole. And of course who else had a history with Dole? I believe Paul Manafort.
Yes.
So there is this sort of complex.
Remember,
here.
Roger Stone was going to be part of the Dole campaign. He was part of the Dole campaign before he had to resign because of the reports of his and his wife's activities involving swingers and sexual. And I was going to say one more thing. Even Dole, interestingly enough, I don't know exactly where Bob Dole aligns, but he was one of the first big conservatives to endorse Donald Trump too. So.
Oh, isn't that's interesting?
And Dole was connected to, along with Jack Kemp, to this Russian immigrant named Ed Lozansky, who's been a key player in shaping this kind of this right-wing relationship involving groups such as the Heritage Foundation to Russia and forming closer relationships, which has kind of gone on kind of under the radar within the more conservative kind of Council for National Policy wing of the Republican establishment. So
interesting. And there is a strong Kansas connection to
the
Trump
here,
administration.
But I think this is good. So,
and even QAnon refers to trust Kansas when I believe it was a reference to Pompeo. But it is interesting that you see the sort of Manafort-Stone connection back in the past to Dole, and then Manafort-Stone back in gear in relationship to Donald Trump. And then last thing in terms of this side tangent we've gone on to around Kansas is that one of the, I believe, 8 senators that went to Russia and met with the Russian government was one of our senators from Kansas, Jim Moran.
Oh, great.
So that's So we were talking about Michael Glassner was one of these guys who confronted after one of these events, and he was not only worked for Eisenberg.
Yeah.
Is that his name?
Lou
Eisenberg. Lou Eisenberg.
Lou Eisenberg, the head of the New York Port Authority, who was involved in all those financial transactions to Larry Silverstein, which, by the way, also Ronald Lauder also worked privatization for the Port Authority, and he went on to be the head of the World Jewish Congress, where he currently serves, and he was the Jewish leader who came out and basically said Donald Trump is not an anti-Semite, has been one of his closest allies as far as within the global Jewish community. But aside from that, Eisenberg, of course, was one of the biggest donors to Trump's inaugural committee. So, and this kind of thing that when you say that all the Jewish power hates Trump, these are the kind of things people don't take into consideration. So that's one of the people that Glassner has worked with over the years. So
that's a good point. So actually, when it comes down to it, the networks of Jewish Zionist power that are closest to Trump are the ones that were closest to Larry Silverstein around September 11th.
And that's a great segue for when we get into our next story, when we start talking about September 11th as related to some of the efforts to try to pin 9/11 on certain limited hangouts. We're going to get into that in a few minutes.
So
I'm glad you mentioned that. We'll go back to that.
Okay, we'll put that on hold. And just before I forget it, for any people interested in 9/11 research, a lot is talked about the privatization of the World Trade Center, and you pointed out Lauder's role in that. Lauder also was involved in pushing the privatization of Stewart Air Force Base, I believe it was called, in Massachusetts, I think. And people should go look at that. And I believe James Perloff has written an article about some of the dynamics of the plane operations surrounding September 11th that might hook into that. So people interested in that, go take a look at that. So back to this issue of the rising, looking again at things like Epstein. and the type of things that potentially compromise both candidacies that we were presented in many ways, it brings us into thinking about mass compromise and mass ConOps, consciousness operations. And so I made an assertion that basically everybody knows QAnon is PsyOps. It very obviously is. Everybody is willing to admit that. Okay, so now we have to analyze what are the potential, what if we were to lay out I'd say there's probably three potential possibilities about what kind of psyops QAnon is. Okay, taking it on its surface in terms of the supporters of it who see it as positive psychological operations, meaning the way that the QAnon, the Q people would see it is the way they claim it to be, is that it represents basically the public intelligence psychological operations arm of a patriotic group, probably nestled deeply within large aspects of U.S. military intelligence, special forces, that type of thing, and that's QAnon as a psychological operation is what it's working to do is slowly introduce some working facility with some of the deeper factual dynamics surrounding the U.S. establishment's criminality. And also criminality all around the world. And that this is in anticipation of a large event of some sort where there's a larger rolling out for larger aspects of the public to be able to understand these deep dynamics of criminality that are going on. And so what's put forth in that is different sort of a series of different kinds of proofs that show that QAnon, whoever or whatever kind of group that is, publishing on 4chan and 8chan and then being distributed throughout the rest of the internet and through memes and analysis, and a lot of it, as we've talked about when we first dealt with Q back late last 2017, I believe, talk about how it's based upon a Socratic or a puzzle-based, a questions-based form. But the way that the supporters of it would point to that part of the credibility, meaning that QAnon is who QAnon says that they are, meaning someone close to Trump, high up in the administration, or at least deep in the architecture, enough to be able to pull off the quote plan. Trust the plan is sort of one of the code words.
Follow the white rabbit, whatever that is.
Right, and then that's interesting too, because there's all these sort of side layers or side symbology that comes along with it. They would say that things like certain pictures that QAnon has posted show that QAnon is close to Trump, and I don't believe that I've been able to fully ferret out whether those are, how undebunkable those so-called proofs of QAnon's closeness. And then a lot is made of Trump announcing the storm. Remember that he's in a line of military figures.
That's the storm that I think it was Mark Glenn of The Ugly Truth that said was Trump was coming after Weinstein as a message to like Hollywood and all that. But I did see that came up very much in that video with of course the Weinstein thing. Then you have to bring Black Cube into question with all of that as well, whether or not that was a Trump operation. I think there was actually some rumblings within even among the InfoWars community that this almost alluding to the idea that this was the Patriots and the Trump people were moving to get some of the Hillary connected pedophiles out, and sex criminals like Weinstein out. But that in this video they did use that Trump talking about the storm. Oh, you'll see what the storm is, and everybody thought the storm was going to be some type military action. But now I think there's now this is being linked as being almost the really beginning of the rolling out of Q was this where Trump had all the military people around him saying, oh, you'll see what the storm is, you'll see. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, and so that's important in terms of the timing of that it was sort of a precursor, or it anticipated the Weinstein storm, or this idea also of the Hollywood criminality that began to be ramped up after that. So that was an interesting hint that there was something deeper to what Trump was referring to. So that's what sort of people who support QAnon would say in relationship to that. I would just point out too, when we think about maybe the darker potentialities of the QAnon psyops, is that this was also in the wake. QAnon came out at the end of October, very end of October, that we should also think about how this was also in the wake of the Las Vegas operation, and the sort of major American Gladio operation that still has not been held to task.
The focus of Las Vegas among like a lot of your conspiracy researchers was on Saudi Arabia, and right at the beginning of November is when Salman had his ascendancy to the top of the with the I don't know if you call it a purge, kind of the Saudi equivalent of the MAGA movement, with the purge of all of the quote-unquote deep state Saudi royalty. So this also happened right around the same time too. And that's very key to, I think, the reshaping of the Middle East under the Trump administration. So that also happened around this time.
And actually the QAnon people say that Q anticipated this in a fairly specific way and gave warning of some type of coup that was about to take place, and so those actions in Saudi Arabia by bin Salman are pointed to as one of the large points of credibility on behalf of Q. So that's interesting. Okay, so then you have that. And let's just sort of put aside the question of who all is the swamp that's being drained potentially, and then of course the other couple things we would need to mention that are put on the table as support for this analysis of the sort of purely positive psyops of Q is things like the sealed indictments. That when you look at it, it looks like they've been people have gone into PACER. PACER, that's an acronym for a legal database around the country where you can go look at things like indictments and cases that have been put forth. I've seen some things that people are confusing a little bit, the difference between a sealed indictment and a sealed case, and that an indictment requires a grand jury, I believe, and a case doesn't necessarily. But it does look like, and I haven't seen any serious debunking of this, that these sealed cases and many of them sealed indictments that look to have been escalated in a massive way, especially in this time frame after QAnon made itself known, that it's gone up by tens of thousands in a way that seems to be factors above normal in relationship to most years where you're talking about 1,000 or something like that in terms of actual sealed indictments. So I'm interested to see if there's other, well-framed critique of those facts, because I haven't seen them. So I think that's, and I think I brought this up before, that's one thing that's compelling to look at, that there's some reality to the nature of the voice of psyops emanating from QAnon. But even if we have these sealed indictments being accurately portrayed, there is also potential a darker analysis of that, which we should go to next. Yeah. But then secondly, there's also this, what you brought up, this idea of the tracking of the people, the resignations, these high-level resignations that are pointed out, that do look to be pretty large scale and out of the ordinary, that do suggest that something is going on. And then the final thing that's usually pointed to is an escalation of potential arrests of human traffickers and those sort of like maybe child pornography operations. And it looks like there's been a slight escalation there, maybe even a doubling in terms of arrests, but more like a significant escalation of those kind of arrests from Obama to Trump. But when you look at it too, it's also looked like it would sort of from Bush to Obama it went up, and from Obama to Trump it went up. But then you go and you look at what the actual nature of some of the arrests are, and it doesn't all look to be high level or highly significant, but then people will say that, well, these are the lower fish that you then use to get at the bigger fish. And then, of course, there are these big arrests and these big cases, such as the NXIVM and the Keith Raniere and the Allison Mack and the aspects of Hollywood that are involved in that, but also the Bronfman.
Although I would raise serious questions about Roger Stone being presented as the whistleblower of this whole thing, like he was the person blowing the whistle. I mean, maybe he was, but I wouldn't exactly take that at face value, considering that he worked on behalf of NXIVM. While this is around the time that he would have been linked to efforts to compromise Elliot Spitzer, as documented by Wayne Barrett, or
Wayne Madsen.
Wayne Madsen, excuse me. I got Wayne Madsen, Wayne Barrett, who wrote a lot about Trump over the years, who basically Roger Stone totally badmouthed the guy after he died and said he's burning in hell, I think. But, Wayne Madsen documented on back when InfoWars and Prison Planet was actually putting out quality work about this kind of stuff. So, I'd question his role as a whistleblower in NXIVM. So,
that's a good point. And maybe people might want to refer back to a antidote from last year that we did called something about going after pedophiles while protecting pedophiles, or something like that. And we sort of focused on the Epstein situation, which I think is a key one. And actually, people should go look at the Trump's face when he was confronted at a rally by a guy with a picture of him of Trump next to Epstein, and Trump looks disturbed, and he really tried to get him out of there very, very, very quickly. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So there's that. So those are sort of the three main points that I think people who point to. Not only is QAnon credible in terms of what QAnon says that QAnon is, in terms of a closeness of the Trump administration, potential high-level aspects of U.S. military intelligence, but then also that it's a positive psyops in relationship to this plan that is meant to actually do mass arrests in terms of taking down the worst criminals amongst us, and all of them point to. So that's one way of considering this.
I'd also throw in there, I'd add to that, for those, I know that a lot of people who are very critical of Zionism, of the elements of Jewish Zionist power, will point out, well, Q did say that we're saving Israel for last. I believe that was something that is attributed to Q, right?
Yes.
That would be where a lot of people would stake their hopes from, say, like an anti-Zionist perspective. And I think they have in my opinion, a largely false impression that, like, what people like Hillary Clinton represent is the true face of Zionism, which I don't necessarily think it is. I think it's actually more, I think these are different factions, and that what, like, say, the Clinton type establishment represents is more of a Western-centered, more what we've seen with the post-World War II order, which is not beholden to Zionism, which, of course, is dedicated to maintaining and preserving Israel as a Jewish state in its current form, but is not with this real hardline, religious, fundamentalist type of Zionism that is very prevalent in both Christian and Jewish circles, which are very pro-Trump, by the way. But, Q did say that, is attributed to have said we're saving Israel for last. So, yeah, I'd play devil's advocate, and it would only be fair to throw that in there as well. But on top of that, taking that into consideration, I'd have to ask, who are we being led to believe are the people that are behind Q? We don't know. Like, it's said to be military intelligence, right? I mean, if someone like Alex Jones is to be believed in this whole argument that, Trump was basically a counter coup with people like, I guess this special force is out of Florida, right? Delta Force, which is where the Jerry Boykin connection would come in. And by the way, Jerry Boykin, just before the 2016 election, posted on his Facebook page that he does not know Steve Pieczenik or Alex Jones. He does not endorse their findings. I would point out this around the time when this ad for this revelation in the movie was constantly playing on InfoWars airwaves, which featured Charlie Daniels and Jerry Boykin in this film about almost how to restore America, right?
And it's mom beef and apple pie.
Yes. Back when back when beef was for supper and apple pie and people loved their moms, right? And they didn't go into transgendered, or there was no mystery about which gender used which restroom, which is what Jerry Boykin, I guess, lost his professorship at some university over protesting. But so that's out there too, and so this is to be believed and I'm not sure about Boykin. Somebody should ask Jerry Boykin about that whole thing
to clarify that.
Yeah, because if these are the kind of people that are the military intelligence, and perhaps there are other people behind the scenes that really are true patriots that are operating even behind the shadows of the Jerry Boykin types, of the types that Alex Jones and Steve Pieczenik keep talking about. And by the way, I should throw this out there because I do believe, and I do think we talked about this a little bit last week, my gut is that the whole Alex Jones, Jerome Corsi split with QAnon. I can't say this as fact, but my gut is my belief is that Jerome Corsi was being outed via people within the Q movement, maybe not at the very top ranks, was almost being outed basically as Israeli agent, as an agent of this, this whole Israeli B'nai B'rith type of international network. And so that's where I think it came out of. I don't think it was necessarily because Q is some type of like white hat. I think it was more or less because Corsi and Jones were kind of saving themselves from being outed. And Jones via his connection to Corsi. That's what I think. But anyway, going back to this, and I talk about this Alex Jones and Pieczenik claims of this military counter coup, and perhaps there are white hats behind the scenes. But if it is people like Jerry Boykin, if it's people like Michael Flynn with his connection to Michael Ledeen, and of course Flynn was in that video, The Storm, Q, the plan to save the world. Michael Flynn was heavily featured in there. Fortunately, I did not see Rudy Giuliani featured in there. Maybe he was, but I don't think he was, and that would be very troubling if he was featured in that whole narrative, although some narratives do have Giuliani as part of the White Hats, which is extremely disturbing, as we're going to get into in a few minutes when we start talking about September 11th. But, I mean, based on what we can see on the surface, these are not, in my opinion, people who have the best interest of the Republic at heart. If you listen to Jerry Boykin, what's he all about? He's all about this hardline, messianic, religious, apocalyptic view of the end times, centering around Israel and the need to basically wield a mighty sword against Israel's enemies and the enemies of Zionism, which ultimately at the end of the day comes down to Islam, and liberals. So I don't think that these are necessarily the white hats we're looking for. So based on what we see with this, if there is credence to this, we're saving Israel for last coming from QAnon necessarily, we could take that into consideration. We should look at, I'm not going to dismiss all of this talk of arrests and of rounding up of traitors and all this within the government, so to speak. But at the same time, though, you cannot just hedge your bets on that based on the people that, if there is some type of military intelligence working to I guess what you call, quote unquote, drain the swamp and working on behalf of Donald Trump, I'm not just going to take this at face value that this is being done for the best interest of the people and of the Republic.
Good breakdown on Jerry Boykin, and these are not the white hats we're looking for. And I do think it's the case that I don't believe that QAnon specifically identified Corsi and Alex Jones by name, but it was pretty apparent to the large amounts of the supporters of QAnon that the QAnon group was referring to those who latched on to the Q movement and were attempting to make fame and money over it, which is interesting too because it fit perfectly into Jerome Corsi's perspective of that he was being picked on by people who hate capitalism, and then I really saw that as a limited hangout because then it tried to redirect. It was all about that. It was about people making money rather than the obvious facts that point to people like Corsi and increasingly Alex Jones as made men of above Israeli intelligence.
I would even point out that I think this is probably before the split between Alex Jones and Jerome Corsi and QAnon, that top Q internet personalities such as Jordan Sather of Destroying the Illusion were promoted by Roger Stone on InfoWars. I think he did an interview with Roger Stone on the War Room. So there was that where, at least for a time, that InfoWars network was promoting people that were very involved with the whole QAnon narrative of interpreting and deciphering all of this information. So there is that, and it does appear that now Jerome Corsi's starting to warm up. Maybe now that this row is kind of is kind of gone now. This whole flap and this whole, maybe it's kind of been forgotten down the memory bin, so to speak. It does seem that Corsi is starting to warm up to the idea of people, of his followers following QAnon again. So there is that too. So I throw that in there. But just based on, I guess I'll wrap it up like this, based on what we see with the personalities involved and who is rumored to be of this military intelligence type of coup, and then of course you have to take in there the whole network of these data gathering networks where so much of this information comes from, the Cambridge Analytica, and the close relationship of these Cambridge, Breitbart type media outlets, Council for National Policy, heavily affiliated, even Adelson via some wings of not only Adelson but also someone like Bernard Marcus, and I can put into the co-founder of Home Depot and his support for Trump, and how much like Sheldon Adelson rallied around Trump when all the the Billy Bush tapes were coming out and all the talk of Trump's quote-unquote locker room banter was coming out. So all of just everything that I see, at least on the surface, and it's nice to believe, it's nice to want to believe that there is something that's going to come out of this, that maybe there is some type of effort to seriously drain the swamp and actually get rid of the criminal elements. It's nice to believe that, but also we've got to look at this logically outside of what you can't see. And what we can see is a very disturbing picture of hardcore Zionist, pro-Israel, dominionist, religious, fundamental operatives, along with this long-time network that has operated as the right arm of the Republican establishment. And it appears to be these same old forces that are steering this narrative, at least from what we can see. And I cannot trust this narrative, not trust that this, I cannot just with my gut instinct or just, I cannot in good faith trust that this is being done on behalf of the best interests of we the people. I just can't.
Okay, let's delve more deeply into that sort of darker, obviously more dangerous potential analysis of what QAnon and the surrounding phenomenon represents. But before we do that, let's just mention what I see as maybe the second interpretation of QAnon, PSYOPs, ConOps, is that it's could be somewhere in between or either or a LARP, live action role playing, and or a puzzle, a created puzzle of some sort. And this would sort of be, and when most people call it psyops, this is probably what they're talking about, and they're saying that it's not what it says it is. It's basically some type of a joke or a made up operation of some sort. Even though I believe that PSYOPs refers to all of these interpretations, because it's a military operation of some sort, no
even
matter
if it
who's
is
behind it.
true white hats, it's still a PSYOP, and then
Yes.
it's being done against. Yeah. So anyway,
right, and so we have to admit that there's such a thing as psychological operations. If you believe you're in a battle or a war, there are psychological operations that all sides could be potentially using. But so if this is something like a puzzle, it may be something related to what's called Cicada. I think it's 3301. I think that's the name of it. I don't quite understand exactly what it is, but it's an online phenomenon that looks to be looking for talented young people who are good at breaking codes, breaking puzzles. It looks like it's probably related to the sort of NSA networks, and there's a conference. I forget what it's called. The conference that NSA comes to and actually recruits from every year in Las Vegas. And so that's one side of it. And then the live action role playing would be something like it's actually just coming directly out of some type of Trump supporters, potentially on the 4chan or 8chan boards. Some people say that a guy who calls himself Pamphlet Anon has sort of been fingered as a potential, or as one of the members of a group of Chan people who are spearheading this, and that it's meant to be positive psyops and sort of bolster the MAGA movement and the Trump movement, and that people are learning how to learn by looking at these puzzles and figuring it out. And then the last thing and related to this interpretation that it could also be that's sort of similar to me, sounds like it, is to what was going on in a way when Obama first came in 2009, that some of the same people such as like David Wilcock, who are invested in aspects of the QAnon narrative, were saying was that their word was Obama was coming in as a light worker and was going to be working behind the scenes with the white hats to do full disclosure of everything from 9/11 to black technology and UFOs and all of this type of thing. And it was a very interesting thing when, I believe it was when Obama went to Norway to accept the Nobel Peace Prize award that he won. There was this very interesting sort of bluish spiral in the sky. Some people said it was just a missile test. Others said it was actually a directed energy weapon that was a show of force. So who knows what all of the reality behind that is. But needless to say, Obama did not disclose the black technology. Obama did not hold 9/11 to account. Right. So whether there were any intentions
we're looking forward, not backward.
Right. That was one of the first things he said. And so that's one thing to consider, that this has to do with the psyops and ConOps that are necessary early on in administration of an alleged outsider, populist like Donald Trump, to try to seal his credibility with his base.
And that's an excellent point, because I think what we're seeing right now is that I think at this point the important thing is, and I'm looking at this from somebody who is inherently distrustful of this whole narrative being something that's going to be for the benefit of humanity. And I've made that up front already, but looking at it from that perspective, which is where my gut lies, it seems to me that there's kind of a twin goal right now. One is to basically store people and keep their faith, or put their faith in the same government that they have been opposed to for so long, because this has always been now the same people that have always been telling you to oppose your government, to oppose the criminality. Now via Trump, you're supposed to support your government. You're supposed to support the Republican Party, because now the good guys have taken over it. And also, it seems to me almost like there's this effort to kind of I don't know if you call it move the goalpost, but almost like move the timetable to where it needs to be. Like, well, not everything's going to get done right now, but if we re-elect Trump, then heads are really going to start to roll. So you have the long-term picture there as well. So if not all this isn't done now, have no fear, because the deep state's really trying to remove him before he can get reelected and really start to clean house. So.
That's one thing I gotta say is when Scott Creighton, Willie Loman Everyman blog, was talking about what Robert David Steele's intentions were in relationship to Cynthia McKinney, he said that it was likely that Steele desired to try to enlist the black vote with McKinney's help to vote for Trump in 2020. I could not believe that there would be any level of that audacity. Yeah. But now it looks like I could see that type of phenomenon happening.
Oh, yeah.
Luckily, Cynthia McKinney, at the very least, has broken out of this idea of looking to Trump for hope. Yeah. There's still the movement necessary there in relationship to the multipolar world and Israel-Russia aspects and BRICS and that type of thing. But that's something
that is
to
interesting, because you've definitely seen some major pushes in that area with the whole Kanye. I'd probably call that a psyop with Kanye West and Candace Owens and all these. What I like to call, I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but I like to call the InfoWars tokens that pop up on there all the time, like Hotep Jesus and people like that. There's definitely an effort to do that, and I'll be interested to see if a similar type effort arises among Hispanic Americans. We'll see, but I mean,
it's interesting. There's no political tokens on there anymore, like there used to be with like. Webster Tarpley, or the sort of someone who's associated more with like the left, but there's no more political tokens on Alex Jones anymore, and it is also the case that that it was interesting that when the Kanye West psyops in relation to Trump happened, there was that interesting picture of Lyra Cohen, the tall Israeli who runs this rap shit, as I think someone I don't know who rapped that, maybe Mos Def, I don't remember, but so that was interesting that all came out. So let's just delve a little bit more deeply into this third potential category of understanding of the QAnon psyops consciousness operations, this more dangerous analysis of it, that this may all be true, that QAnon, what QAnon represents, is somehow very close to Trump, whether it's an actual person, sort of similar to this whole question that we've talked about the difference between Mega the Mole versus Mega the Group, or the Mr. X supporting the Pollard spying, or the X committee that it actually probably turned out to be, of the Albert Wohlstetter kids and Pearl and Gaffney and all of that whole crew. There's a question then also that if QAnon is as close as QAnon says that they are, she are to Trump, that it could be something as the difference between the mole versus the group. And as if we're interpreting, obviously, that there's this level above Israeli intelligence, a level above Mossad, that people like Jerome Corsi and increasingly Alex Jones pretty blatantly, and definitely Roger Stone, are talking openly about communicating with in relationship to the Trump administration. You could see that closeness is actually some type of technical spying closeness of some sort, whether it's Talpiot based and it's sort of like the Israelis facility to work from behind the scenes in terms of all of these spy networks, or if it really is just literally a person or group of people that are close.
And also, I will say one more thing about this, is that if we're looking for the kind of people that we're talking about, I would say someone like Ezra Cohen Watnick would be the perfect example of that. And there's been I would say almost near silence. We had the article came out in the Atlantic, right? The man McMaster couldn't fire, and he was basically implicated as the person who gave Congressman Devin Nunes his memo, right, about those who were put the information about Trump being spied on allegedly during the campaign, right? And some of the what the alt media is portraying as the phoniness of Russiagate. He was cited as being the source of that whole thing. And then now, almost quietly, and I mean, we've discussed it, maybe a few other people have, Cohen Watnick is in the Justice Department, and who knows what his role is. So, and this is something that people have been very, very quiet about. So when you think of this network above Mossad, that who knows if he's involved with Q in any way, but I mean, as far as like the white hats, these are the kind of people, another one of the people who is perceived as the person you're supposed to believe is like this white hat within that is helping Trump like drain the swamp or whatever. So I didn't want to mention that. And
it's really important that you brought up Cohen Watnick, because then I remember, right, he was then brought back into the administration in the Justice Department.
Yes.
And a lot is made through the QAnon actual posts, but also in the networks of this Huber, this prosecutor in Utah who's operating under Jeff Sessions, and who has over 400 assistants, sort of prosecutorial assistants. And then so I believe it's relevant that Ezra Cohen Watnick has been brought back in the administration into the Justice Department, not heading of National Security Council intelligence as he was before, but directly in the Justice Department. And wasn't one Michael Chertoff's role in the Justice Department in terms of the head of the criminal division right after September 11th, that was the key role in standing down the real investigation into September 11th. So then that points to potential, the dark potential around this QAnon phenomenon, that it's real and that it does represent something more like a Red Dawn type of operation, but with a heavily Likud flavor to it, a Zionist, dominionist, sort of vast right-wing conspiracy.
You mentioned Red Dawn, because now the InfoWars people are using the Wolverine battle cry as a means to get their base behind Trump. So it's kind of funny you mentioned that, the Wolverine battle cry. But anyway, also Chertoff and Mukasey both went on to head the Justice Department via being they were both No, Chertoff was Homeland Security. Mukasey was Attorney General.
Yes,
Okay.
and Chertoff was head of the Justice Department Criminal Division,
Okay.
I believe, in the wake of September 11th.
Okay. And of course, I can't go without remissing that Mukasey's son, Mark, is the representative of Joel Zamel, who ties into this Cambridge Analytica type group in Israel that did similar data mining work. That seemed to be one of the kind of people who Robert Mueller, when his investigation was over in Israel a few weeks ago, was zeroing in on. So,
and this is a good point too, because that should also then be expanded. We'll link to a story that's been done about the actual financial provenance of I believe of Psy Group, not Wikistrap, but of Psy Group, Joel Zamel's company that has been implicated in discussions at high level with the Trump administration. That the financials actually run back towards Cyprus again, and you have Wilbur Ross's connection there, but also into a Russian background. And so this is clearly part of this Russia Gate and this relationship to Israel in the midst of this Russia Gate is clearly part of what's at stake here in terms of the QAnon analysis.
Interestingly enough, in one of his SGT reports video where he was basically calling out his critics, right, on the whole QAnon phenomenon thing, and you just want to attack Trump. One of the articles that was running across the screen when he was dismissing all this stuff was this was this SGT report video. I think the one he put out on the 4th of July was ran articles, headlines about Wilbur Ross bailing out Trump while he was with Rothschild Inc. And of course, Wilbur Ross directly ties into the Cyprus things. These are things that people within the Q movement that are proponents of QAnon do not want you looking at, and you'd have to ask why. And so I just thought about that there real quick.
So we do have to keep our eye on this moving forward. And if it turns out that QAnon is everything that its supporters say it is in terms of where we go one, we go all, and this is not about partisanship, and this is about the draining of the totality of the swamp, even then we would have to be careful around the sort of insistence upon military tribunals, and I believe that sort of like will undermine our aspirations for a just rule of law, where we actually need civilian courts for the public to become educated to all of this. So even if that were the case, the most positive imaginations around this turn out to be true this summer or whenever, we also have to keep our eye on it. But most intensely, let's say there is an increase in high-level arrests, but just as the plan to save the world video, there's a lot. There's some Bushes and some Republicans featured, but it's almost all completely. It's the Obama administration, a focus on the Clintons, and clearly the Bushes and the Clintons were sort of part and parcel of the same group. They were a different group than what's represented by this hardcore right-wing Likud Israeli-centric
That's
group.
where the confusion, when you tie all of these people as being one and the same. People associate Bush as being like, on one hand being the globalist, but also being like the epitome of like the hardcore neoconservatism, when the Bush administration really was not that. There was a battle within the Bush administration, and I think the hardliners lost out. The real hardcore, religious type hawks who were pushing they've kind of taken over the Trump administration. They lost out in the Bush administration. That's my belief. And so when we have this confusion as to what a neocon is or what a hawk is, then it's this one size fits all for anybody who's associated with, like, say, the Bill Kristol wing of the Republican Party. That's not the beginning or the end of it. So I think that's a big part of why this narrative is able to thrive.
And of course, the event that was the transformative event, not only of the new century and the project so-called thereof, but also of the Bush administration that allowed the sort of neoconservatives to take the helm of the foreign policy coup, as General Wesley Clark termed it, was, of course, September 11th.
And now that's a perfect segue to get back into it, because we talked about a little bit earlier when we mentioned Louis Eisenberg and Michael Glassner and this his association with Lou Eisenberg and this Port Authority connection with the New York, very likely dual American-Israeli citizens who were involved in the in the financial, and if they weren't dual citizens officially, they are in all but name, basically, because we know where the loyalties of like your Eisenbergs and your Silversteins and your Lowies, where their loyalties really do lie. And I don't think it's with the Republic, but anyway, we brought up these people, and this is just another example of how it's not just this network of like the Bill Kristol, David Frum, Robert Kagan, never Trump neocons, that this goes above them in a lot of ways, this financial network. And it doesn't appear that they were really in the same circles. The ones who get implicated for September 11th via like PNAC and Project for New American Century, and it does seem, you mentioned this earlier, the people around Trump, so many of them are connected to this network that were responsible for putting the ownership of the World Trade Center into the hands of Larry Silverstein. And we'd also have to look at someone like, this is where we get into where some of the more recent, now once again, certain people with the initials AJ are making noise about Trump exposing September 11th again, centering around Robert Mueller working with the deep state and the Saudis and radical Islam to pull off September 11th, when you've got a guy who very likely, when nobody's talking about this network anymore. And of course, one of the white hats, Rudy Giuliani, is right in there in the administration, is rooting out the deep state, when Giuliani, his own complicity in September 11th is very well documented. And someone like Giuliani increasingly is not with this whole crystal wing of the kind of the neocon hawks, but is more in line with this international mafia type ring that falls into these business transactions that took place on September 11th. So while Alex Jones and Roger Stone are telling you that, oh, Trump's going to expose September 11th via Robert Mueller in Saudi Arabia, no, I mean, you've got a much more, I think, obvious September 11th criminal with a more well-documented history of being exposed as a 9/11 criminal that is right there in the administration working on behalf of Donald Trump as one of his personal lawyers.
Yes, exactly. So what we could term this is as the controversialization and weaponization of 9/11 quote-unquote truth. And Alex Jones has been doing this for a while, actually, but he rolls it out at key moments, whether to support the narrative that Trump is a sort of a sleeper patriot, sleeper bircher, truther scenario, or when it's trying to attack the apparent opponents or dangers to Trump, as it is in this scenario where Roger Stone and Alex Jones are basically indicating that Trump's taking off the gloves to expose Robert Mueller's conspiracy with basically the Saudis and this sort of obscure deep state that probably just mainly ties into the Clintons and George Soros in some way.
Well, George Soros is the be-all, end-all. You know, everything begins and ends with him. He is the alpha and omega of evil.
He answers directly to the Dracos and or Lucifer, probably.
Yeah.
So this is something that we've seen before, though. Actually, we saw Trump weaponize 9/11 quote-unquote truth even during the debates, and during that time, I think it was probably on False Flag Weekly News, I pointed out that it was actually even fairly effective. Even Trump's sort of half-limited hangout truth-telling did seem to knock out Jeb Bush out of the election pretty quickly, and also even when Trump went half-ass on the JFK situation and accused Cruz's father of being implicated, and that seemed to work pretty well too. Yeah. So we need to keep an eye on this, and the way to sort of intervene here, of course, is to call into the Alex Jones radio show and put the real dynamics of September 11th truth on the table, and remind Alex Jones's audience that he once, if not the best friend of 9/11 truth, was at least not an enemy of it as he seems to have become now.
Yeah, indeed. And so I'd also recommend maybe try to make more and more noise as Jerome Corsi gets ready to launch his big internet project. Maybe try to infiltrate into those circles more. Maybe try to call into programs like Aaron Klein Investigative Radio via Breitbart, and that hardcore Israeli operative that's acting on behalf of Trump that was directly implicated or directly labeled by Steve Bannon himself as the person who came up with the idea to have Trump's or Clinton's accusers sit in the front row at the presidential debate. So there's all kinds of roads we can take. And we can also maybe start to get into some of the more progressive type media, such as the Tom Hartman show, and start calling into those outlets. So there's all kinds of things we can do. And I do plan on starting to step up my efforts in terms of calling into some of these programs. But certainly we need to continue focusing on Alex Jones and that whole network, because they are the mainstream media in the age of Trump.
Yep.
And they are shaping the narrative.
So it's time to escalate the discourse, stay involved. We got to keep our eyes on the ball. So until next week, Antidote, we out.